You've been saying that for the past 2 years since Security Breach came out. Why is this any different?
Trust me, I had the right idea this time. I got new evidence, new theories, and new information.
Last time you said that Split Games was formed.
Okay, this is different. I made it so that everyone wins in the end this time. Even you can't disagree with it, Tux.
Yeah, right. Your theories are ridiculous. Talk to me when you've actually had good ideas.
You won't have to wait long. With the final Tales from the Pizzaplex book being released, it seemed to most like FNAF was at a stopping point. Security Breach and its DLC have all been pretty much solved so far, with exceptions of course, so there hasn't been much discussion in the theorist community. With that thought in mind, I thought it'd be a good idea to look forward to the future, as Scott said. But before I begin, I wanted to first tell you guys a little mini theory that I had about a week ago before writing this script. It doesn't really have anything to do with the main theory, but I just wanted to put it out there as a thought for other people. So, in The Real Jake, on the final night of the story, there are strange noises coming from Jake's Simon doll. Jake's mom hears them and goes to check the noises, and when she enters the room, the noises disappear. Jake ends up dying soon after. He ends up possessing the Simon doll, whose mask ends up becoming the mask for the Stitch Wraith, which he can see out of and control. Jake in the Stitch Wraith helps homeless people by enhancing their positive memories and doing the same with the spirits. In Stinger 7, the Afton amalgamation is loose and wreaking havoc. Larson is infected and Jake is disabled. So Larson goes to the evidence locker to get his duffel bag, and we hear those exact same whisper noises coming from that bag that came from Jake's room that night. Larson opens the bag and guess what he finds inside? The puppet. This means that the puppet was the one making the whisper noises in Jake's room, and Jake ended up dying shortly after. So I believe that the puppet somehow gave Jake some of its power of happiness to help enhance positive memories and spirits and help them move on, like he does with Andrew and like how Charlotte does in FNAF 3. That's only a mini theory, however, and it doesn't have to do with the main theory. Speaking of which, who could the next villain after the Mimic is killed for good be? Well, that is what I think I have figured out. And by that, I mean my strong opinion. I'm not saying any of this is true, and facts, so take it with a grain of salt. But without further ado, let's get into the main theory of the true identity of the future villain of Five Nights at Freddy's.
Every wall, every place, something dark is following me here without a trace. Is it real or in my head? I guess I'll find out when I wake up back home or dead. Dreadfully, terribly, something is amiss, but I won't mind the feeling, it's all made up in my head.
So, my idea for the future villain completely depends on the theory you believe regarding Fazbear Frights. Now, in the story Lally's Game from Tales 1, the end of the story has white eyes peering over the top of the box that's in the attic with the stuff that Cade and his fiancée keep as memorabilia. In the final Stitch Ray stinger, when Larson is getting visions of Eleanor, he also finds Eleanor inside a box in an attic with stuff that looks like memorabilia. Eleanor is also described to have white eyes, meaning Eleanor was responsible for Lally's game, which means a few different things. One, it means that Eleanor somehow comes back after the final stinger and that the stingers are in the games, or that they are not, but the mimic epilogues are. So it's basically saying that Eleanor is responsible even if it's not necessarily the same Eleanor. Now, the theory that I believe is called split-line games, and that basically says that the timeline splits after FNAF 6, where one side leads to the Stitch Ray stingers and the other leads to the Pizzaplex in the Security Breach era, where the Pizzaplex is built over the FNAF 6 pizzeria, preventing the Stitch Ray stingers from happening. And since Eleanor was created before the events of FNAF 6, she would exist in both timelines. Now, quick deviation here. I theorize that Eleanor is basically the Shadow, and the Shadow is the creature made of pure evil and agony that feeds off of the suffering of others, just like Eleanor. It's also described to have long black tentacles. This took the form of Pit Trap initially in the story Into the Pit with Oswald. It also took the form of Kelsey in the story The New Kid, and lots of other forms throughout the Fazbear Frights. Now, if that's the case with Eleanor existing in both timeline branches, then she would still be around in the games, right? But if that were the case, then where would she be? Well, let me cook for a second. I'm sure most of you watching this video know about the story Frailty from Tales 1. Now, before you all roll your eyes, no, I'm not saying that the new villain is Eleanor again or a version of her, and there's a specific reason. For those who don't know, Frailty is about a girl named Jessica who at some point finds a heart-shaped pendant and discovers that it has healing properties. She decides to use this supernatural force to help the less fortunate, and Jessica is able to get a job as a janitor at her local hospital so that she can use the pendant to heal sick children when no one is around. She uses a knife to slice off bits of the pendant, with the pieces landing on the person and healing them. However, this weakens her own body in the process, turning her into a frail-looking figure, giving the story its name. Now, this is where the interesting part comes into play. In the climax of the story, Jessica has a dream where a being with metal footsteps, which she recognizes, chases her and rips her limbs off. The being takes her pendant away before the dream ends. Now, any fan of this franchise who has read the books would immediately think that this is Eleanor, right? Well, here's the problem. Eleanor died at the end of Fazbear Frights when she was killed by Jake with the help from Larson, trapping her in a nightmare and effectively killing her. The ball pit shown in Into the Pit contains the victims of Eleanor, aka the Shadow or the Agony, and the contents of the pit turn to shards of glass following the final epilogue, signifying that Eleanor's victims have moved on and that she is fully dead. Even if you don't believe that the Fazbear Frights books or the Stitch Ray stingers are in the games, Eleanor would still be dead. But then animatronic Apocalypse was released. In that story from Tales number 4, the main character Robbie's principal, Mr. Renner, basically starts a cult with his students. Mr. Renner acts weird and almost not human throughout the entire time, and at the end of the story, Robbie has a big fight and kills him. After his death, he starts to bleed a black liquid, and even the police at the end are confused as to how a human can, quote,
bleed motor oil, end quote. Mr. Renner has the exact characteristics of an Agony being, and the main source of Agony is the shadow, so it has to be Eleanor, right? But if Eleanor is dead, then how are these types of things still happening in the Pizzaplex era of the timeline? Well, I'll have my friend Evan explain.
There's a theory that states that Eleanor is actually Shadow Freddy, and this comes from the fact that Shadow Freddy is Nightmare according to the FNAF 4 files, and the fact that he's a dark reflection of Fredbear and is see-through and ghostly, and Nightmare says in Ultimate Custom Night that he is William's wickedness made of flesh. Shadow Freddy is essentially the evil of William, probably created after William killed Charlotte or maybe the missing children or something. Eleanor being Shadow Freddy could make sense in that regard, since Eleanor is a shadow character created from evil and agony, and is heavily associated with William Afton. So Eleanor and Nightmare could potentially be the same entity. Nightmare in the FNAF 4 Halloween DLC is actually replaced by Nightmarion, so while he is also connected to the puppet, the actual Nightmarion entity is the same character as Nightmare, and by extension Shadow Freddy.
Thank you, Evan. And the reason we're bringing all this up is because of the Nightmarion imagery in Security Breach, with the Nightmarion staff bots and the Nightmarion plushies, which are referred to as the Nightmare plushies, simply. Because then we would finally have an answer as to why Nightmarion keeps appearing over and over again in the modern games. Nightmarion, at least from an in-universe perspective, came from the FNAF VR game according to the plushie's description in Ruin, so it's entirely possible that the sequel to the debut game of Nightmarion is when he will make his first full villainous appearance. It also doesn't undermine the quote-unquote great ending of FNAF 6, because with this theory, you can still say that Henry's plan worked. Everyone was freed, and their shadows are just carrying on their legacy. I'm not trying to imply anything, but it seems like FNAF is trying to hint at Eleanor or Shadow Freddy or Nightmarion or any of the shadow characters being important in the story going forward. There's also a weird page in the character encyclopedia, and before we go into this, while most people don't find the character encyclopedia to be reliable, I think it can be used as supplementary evidence to a theory instead of the main point. Anyway, what does the character encyclopedia say about Shadow Freddy? Well, quote, "We don't know much about him. Will he turn out to be a crucial character in the ongoing mythology of Five Nights at Freddy's? Maybe, maybe not. Only time will tell." End quote. It's not really that concrete, but it really seems to be hinting at something, so it's entirely possible that maybe after the Mimic, or even alongside the Mimic, that Shadow Freddy or Eleanor could be an important villain in the future of FNAF. If you don't think that Frights is in the games, or even connected to the games besides parallels, then you could just say that Eleanor is a parallel to Shadow Freddy or Nightmarion, meaning either of them could still be a future villain. And if you think that Eleanor is dead, then you can say that Shadow Freddy isn't Eleanor. Meaning, the theory works either way, no matter which timeline you believe, and no matter which way you look at it. Of course, this is mostly just speculation, but I think the theory makes a lot of sense, and I'd like to know you guys' thoughts. Anyway, that's all we got for today, and as of course, thank you guys for listening to my theory, and I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your lives. Journal entry 1. Subject RWQ. Nickname Shadow Bonnie. This one has always given me trouble in the lore. I never know what to believe with it. Alright, let's start with what we have. In Hide and Seek, Toby's anger manifests as Shadow Bonnie. In that same story, Shadow Bonnie is fueled by more negative emotions, anger, sharp teeth, and claws, just like Nightmare in FNAF 4. Okay, good. Noted. RWQ could be a benevolent entity, which is why it helps in Happiest Day. Okay, so why would it fear Shadow Freddy? Well, remember, Shadow Freddy is William's wickedness, and we know that William has a rivalry complex due to his ego and stuff. Of course, this assumes that RWQ is indeed benevolent, which does not appear to be the case in hide and seek. But that is assuming that the RWQ we see in the story is the same one from FNAF 2. But if that RWQ we see in FNAF 2 is the same one we see in hide and seek, and that is the shadow, then that would mean that he's evil. But if he is evil, then why is he helping with Happiest Day in FNAF 3? Do you see my frustration with this series? Alright, let's take a new perspective. If RWQ is Shadow Freddy, then that means he fears himself. But that doesn't make sense because Shadow Freddy is the shadow. So why does he fear the shadow if the shadow... Good lord. Alright, let's try FNAF AR. In FNAF AR, RWQ appears to be made of the Dark Remnant substance. Alright, cool. What is Dark Remnant? Well, according to Fazbear Frights, Remnant is the mixing of the tangible with the intangible, of memory with the present, the people and things that are lost. It makes them almost real again. End quote. Going off of this definition and how Molten MCI works in the games, it would seem as though RWQ is made of negative emotions and memories with the mix of some physical objects. But what are those physical objects? Could they be the AR animatronic endoskeletons? It's possible. Is it Andrew's Agony? It's also possible. See, writing and researching made me have to rethink some ideas, and I might potentially explore this sort of idea again going forward, so that way I can try and see how those sorts of things match up with my current understanding of the shadows. Further research will be required.